Had the blessing to attend school out on the East Coast in Baltimore back in the late 80s and early 90s. St. Mary's Seminary and University happens to be the first and the oldest seminary in the United States. And I still remember to this day that orientation week, and when they introduced us to seminary life and everything that it entailed. But we also went on a history tour, and part of that history tour was seeing the original building and place where the seminary was on Paca Street in downtown Baltimore. And also, we stepped over to a building that Mother Seton, Elizabeth Ann Seton, St. Elizabeth Ann Seton, started that first parochial school, that Catholic school, where she brought that education there to the city of Baltimore and how it spread, obviously, throughout our country. And I can still remember, going in there, and there was this one quote that was in a book or, off to the side somewhere that kind of spoke a little bit about her life and what her life was truly all about. And she said, there's three things. Seek the will of God, do the will of God, and you do this because it is the will of God. I just was, I reflected on today and just kind of reflected on that moment. And I remember how inspired I was at that time to say to myself, as I was seeking out ministry, whatever direction it was going to take in my life, and I said, I don't want to do anything else except what God is asking of me. Much like Elizabeth Ann Seton. I mean, her life. I mean, if you know her life, she came from wealth and, ended up in poverty and, said, I'm going to do something for my own kids, but also for other kids. And she brought that education because she just thought to herself, this is what God is asking of me. I'm just going to do God's will. I think so often we get wrapped up in our own little lives, and we think about really what we want always or what we need always, rather than just stepping back and saying, just put it in God's hands. This is God's will in my life. I mean, I've had many times in my life where I've gotten frustrated because this hasn't gone this way, the way I wanted it to, or that way. And I remember just taking a deep breath and just saying, I got to find God's will here. Let me seek it, let me do it. And I do it, why? Because it is His will. And then I just accept it, whatever that may be. And I think the moment you begin to accept God's will in your life, I think you begin to find peace and understanding, contentment. Like I always preach, and we always preach up here, we're always going to be faced with challenges and tough times. But it's that will of God, that is going to get us through it. We have to define that in our lives, and we have to find out what that is, but we keep pursuing it. I often think that St. Elizabeth Ann Seton, probably had John's letters, his epistles, maybe at her hand, always reading them, following them. Because I love that for the next, several days we're going to listen, to John's epistles. And I've always heard it can be summed up in a very simple way, and that is love, light, and life. Love, light, and life. And you want to know how to live? First you begin with love. Not the champagne and roses, but it's the compassion. It's the kindness. It's always seeking that out. There's God's will, And then it's the light. I mean, do we choose light? Do we choose darkness? Do we choose to live our lives letting Him guide us, bring us through the darkness, or do we dwell and live in the darkness? That's God's will. Live in that light. And the last one, just life. Anything that brings us destruction, anything that brings us down is not life-giving. I often tell my kids, in their pursuit of relationships, be it a friendship, be it, that companionship, that partner in life, seek someone that's going to give you life. Somebody's going to build you up. If somebody tears you down, if somebody brings you down, I don't think that's too life-giving. The will of God, I truly believe, is thinking about that love, thinking about that light, and thinking about that life just a little bit more in our lives. Elizabeth Ann Seton, I think, inspired us. It's good to read about her, to think about her, and to think about how she said, I just want to do the will of God. That's it. Period. End of story. I just want to serve God by doing his will. Maybe we need to think about that a little bit more.